Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of Law Talk. I'm Mark, the Director Judson.
Jonathan, Law Dog Fontenot.
Native of Cameron Parish, Louisiana, Lake Charles attorney, covering all of your legal needs from the marshes of Cameron Parish to the courtrooms of Lake Charles. This edition of Law Talk, owner finance. Owner finance. Should we go bond for deed or vendor's lien? Bond for deed or vendor's lien? What do you think, Law Dog?
I know nothing of either of those topics.
Bond for deed. So the question is, do you want to own it or do you just want to pay on it and then own it after you pay it off?
Okay, what's the advantage of owning it?
All right, so vendor's lien, if you go on an owner finance arrangement, that's where the seller sells the buyer the property, but instead of making monthly payments to a bank, you're making monthly payments to the seller.
But the land is in my name in the meantime.
In the vendor's lien, the title transfers at the time of purchase.
Okay.
So in a vendor's lien, the seller is rid of the responsibilities of ownership. The seller is no longer responsible for the taxes because he doesn't own it anymore.
And the tax assessors will show my name.
The tax assessors will cut it over into the buyer's name. So the seller is no longer responsible for the ownership responsibilities because the seller doesn't own it anymore. So the seller has no liability for the taxes. He has no liability for any kind of trips and falls or any kind of environmental hazards or any kind of, parish liens, parish ordinances, zoning issues.
So the disadvantage to the buyer on that kind is what?
The buyer is the owner and has all ownership responsibilities.
Just the obligations and responsibilities.
Right. Now here is a disadvantage to the seller. The disadvantage to the seller is that if the buyer defaults, the seller has to go through a foreclosure process just like a bank. It's expensive, it takes time, big judicial process, a lot of money, got to get the sheriff involved, got to seize it, got to sell it at a sheriff's sale, etc., and so forth. So the advantage to the seller is that the seller is rid of the responsibilities of ownership. Disadvantage, if he wants to foreclose or if the buyer quits making payments, got to go through the foreclosure process. Bond for deed, exactly opposite. Bond for deed, the seller is not really a seller. The seller is like a glorified landlord. And there is a contract or a bond for deed, and it simply says that the buyer is making the payments. When the buyer pays the seller off, the seller at that time
makes him the owner.
Will be contractually obligated to deed the property.
So
deed the property to the buyer at that time.
If you miss the payments on the bond for deed, how does it revert to the owner? Or it never becomes the
owner has never lost title to the property. So then at that point in time, the owner can go through an eviction process. Now there's going to be a lot of peculiarities in a bond for deed contract that don't necessarily apply, but in general theory, the seller, the bond for deed seller, is still the title owner to the property. So if the buyer quits making the payments, simply evicts them, avoids the foreclosure cost, avoids the foreclosure expense. The danger is that it's really not a good deal for the buyer because the buyer has less protection. If the buyer misses payments, the buyer is more subject to losing the land. It's usually for a situation where the buyer doesn't have quite the credit history or the credit value and a little bit more of a higher risk, so the seller likes to hold on to the property in the bond for deed process.
But the buyer made 99 of 100 payments and didn't miss the 100th. He's still
subject to being evicted.
Wow, okay.
You actually have had a contested issue on that very matter.
Yeah.
And sometimes some sellers will say, payment number 100, sorry, you haven't paid your insurance, you hadn't paid the taxes, you violated it, we're going to go to litigation.
Right.
So bond for deed, not as preferred for the buyer, but it's still a viable option. So bond for deed or vendor's lien title transfers at the time of purchase, bond for deed title transfers at the end of the payments.
Right, gotcha.
This has been another edition of Law Talk, a public service of the Southwest Louisiana Law Center and CBS Lake Charles.